Chapter 1. The royal castle's kitchen came alive long before the sun touched the spires. Sarah knew that better than anyone. 3 years of service had trained her body to rise with the dawn bells, before her mind had even fully registered that morning had come. She lit the oven with practiced movements, added another log, and watched the flames catch, far smaller and more obedient than the fire breathed by the masters of this castle. "Sarah, that bread isn't going to knead itself," called Griselda, the cook, a woman with hands that looked as though they had been shaped from dough, and a voice capable of cutting through any amount of kitchen noise. "Coming!" Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to the wooden table, where the starter had risen overnight into a soft, billowing mound. She liked working with dough. There was something soothing about the repetition, something that required no unnecessary thought. Knead, let it rise, divide it, knead again. Simple tasks for a simple girl. Or so she had always thought of herself. She had turned 25 3 weeks earlier. There had been no celebration. Orphans did not mark birthdays with the same grandeur as noble families. But Griselda had baked her a small apple tart, and the other kitchen girls had sung a badly off-key but heartfelt song. Sarah remembered that evening fondly. She had no idea that the day of her 25th birthday had marked the boundary between the life she had always known and the one that was about to begin. "Take this tray to the small library," Griselda ordered, nodding toward a tray of tea and freshly baked flatbread. "Counselor Edric asked for it early. Poor man's been working on the archives all night." Sarah picked up the tray, automatically balancing it against her hip, and made her way through the narrow servants' corridors into the main part of the castle. She had spent the past year serving at the palace. Before that, she had worked for 3 years in the orphanage kitchen. By now, she knew every turn in these halls and every creaking floorboard best avoided if one did not want to wake the nobility before their time. The small library was in the eastern wing, not far from the royal chambers, a part of the castle ordinary kitchen maids rarely had reason to enter. Sarah walked quickly, her eyes lowered to the floor, already thinking about getting back before Griselda began preparing the noble's morning meal. She did not see him until it was too late. Azarian stepped around the corner so suddenly that he seemed to have emerged from the stone walls themselves. He was tall and dressed in a dark traveling cloak. From the scent of cold air and smoke still clinging to his clothes, he had clearly just returned from a nighttime flight over the kingdom's borders. Sarah recoiled, somehow managing not to drop the tray, then hurried into an awkward bow. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I didn't see—" She raised her eyes to finish the apology. The words died in her throat. Azarian was staring at her, as though he had seen something impossible. There was no anger in his expression, no irritation. It was the way a man might look at a ghost risen from a grave sealed long ago. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly, as though he had instinctively drawn in the air around her, trying to identify some elusive scent. His golden eyes, faintly luminous, the eyes of a dragon that retained something inhuman, even in his mortal form, lingered on her face, far longer than propriety allowed. A strange chill ran over Sarah's skin, as though the air around him had suddenly dropped several degrees, despite the warm spring day beyond the windows. "What is your name?" Azarian asked. His voice was low and rough, as though the question had escaped him before he could think better of it. "Sarah, Your Majesty." She stood perfectly still, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. "I work in the kitchens." "How long?" The question came out sharper, more demanding than a simple conversation with a servant warranted. Sarah blinked, unable to understand what had sparked such interest. "1 year here at the castle, Your Majesty. Before that, I worked in the orphanage kitchen for 3 years. Azarian said nothing. He continued staring at her with the same expression, a mixture of confusion and something deeper, something more unsettling that even he seemed unable to name. Sarah noticed his fingers clenching and unclenching at his sides, as though he were restraining himself from stepping closer. "Strange," he finally murmured, more to himself than to her. "I don't remember you." "I'm hardly surprised, Your Majesty." Sarah allowed herself a small, cautious smile, hoping to ease the inexplicable tension between them. "There are plenty of kitchen maids and only one king. It would be stranger if you remembered every one of us." Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite a smile, more like the sudden realization that the girl standing before him was no frightened little mouse, but someone with enough presence of mind to joke with the Dragon King in a narrow corridor at dawn. "Perhaps you're right," he said, and for the first time, there was something almost self-deprecating in his voice. Then his gaze sharpened again. "But I would have remembered you. I'm certain of it." Sarah had no answer. The king's words hung between them, strange and far too personal for a chance encounter in a corridor. Heat rose to her cheeks, not because she was embarrassed by his title, but because of something else, something inexplicable that had awakened inside her the moment their eyes met. Azarian seemed to realize how strange his own words had sounded. He stepped back half a pace, and his expression became unreadable once more. The royal mask returned so quickly that Sarah almost wondered whether she had imagined that brief moment of vulnerability. "Go," he said shortly. "I won't keep you from your duties." "Yes, Your Majesty." Sarah bowed and hurried away. She could feel his gaze on her back long after she turned the corner. Only when she reached the relative safety of an empty servants' passage did she allow herself to stop and breathe. She pressed one hand to her chest. Her heart was beating far too quickly for a simple encounter with her king. What was that? She stared at her trembling hand. She had no answer. She only knew that something about the encounter had felt wrong, not frightening exactly, but strange. As though the world had shifted slightly off its familiar axis, and she had yet to discover in which direction. Azarian watched her until the last fold of her plain brown dress disappeared around the corner. Only then did he allow himself to lean one shoulder against the cold stone wall, as though his strength had suddenly deserted him. What in the name of the ancestors had that been? He had spent the entire night flying over the northern borders, investigating reports of unrest among the mountain tribes. He had returned exhausted and irritable, ready to drink a cup of strong wine and sleep until noon. Nothing could have prepared him for what had happened in that corridor. For the strange, overwhelming sensation that had seized him the moment an ordinary kitchen maid nearly collided with him, a tray balanced in her hands. The scent. That was what it had been. Not perfume, not the soap used to wash dishes. Something deeper, something primal. As though her very blood carried a fragrance that the dragon within him recognized on instinct, bypassing reason entirely. Azarian could not find the right word for the sensation. It was somewhere between thirst and peace, like a starving beast suddenly scenting water after days in the desert. He shook his head, trying to clear it. "You're tired," he told himself. "Too much flying. Too little sleep. Your mind is playing tricks on an exhausted body." But even to him, the explanation sounded unconvincing. Azarian straightened and continued toward his chambers, yet his thoughts stubbornly returned to the girl. "A year in the castle," she had said. That meant he must have passed her dozens of times over the past 12 months. The castle corridors were not so vast that a kitchen servant and the reigning king could have avoided crossing paths forever. So why did he have no memory of her? And why had today's encounter felt as though he were seeing her for the first time in his life? He stopped outside his chambers, one hand resting on the cold door handle. Then he felt it. The thing he had been hiding from the entire court for months. a dull, dragging pain deep in his chest, where a dragon's fire should have burned. The ashen sickness. It reminded him of its presence as it always did, quietly, insidiously, like a mocking whisper arriving at the worst possible moment. Azarian pressed a hand to his chest and waited for the pain to ease enough that he could move without risking some passing servant witnessing his weakness. After a minute, his breathing steadied. He entered his chambers and pushed all thoughts of the strange kitchen maid into the furthest corner of his mind. Pushed them away, but did not forget. That same night, lying awake in her room in the servants' wing, Sarah found herself remembering another meeting, one that had happened many years earlier, long before she entered service at the castle, when she had still been a child living in an orphanage on the outskirts of the capital. The orphanage was administered by the temple, though it survived largely on donations from noble families, eager to ease their consciences before the gods, with one generous offering each year. Most benefactors arrived, handed out coins and sweets, spoke a few kind words in front of the headmistress, and left satisfied that they had done their duty, without remembering a single child's face. Lord Gareth, Damien's father, had been different. He visited more than once a year, and he brought more than coins. Books, toys, warm clothing for winter. He also brought his son, a boy a few years older than Sarah, with serious dark eyes and manners far too mature for his age, as though he had already learned every lesson about how a noble heir was expected to behave. Sarah remembered their first real meeting, not one of the formal visits when gifts were handed out, but the afternoon when 10-year-old Damien had been left in the orphanage garden while his father spoke with the headmistress. He wandered toward the far wall, where 8-year-old Sarah was hiding from the other children, with a battered book of fairy tales she had stolen from the orphanage's communal library. "What are you reading?" he asked, sitting beside her on the grass without caring that he might stain his expensive trousers. "A story about a dragon who fell in love with an ordinary shepherd girl," she replied cautiously, ready to snap the book shut and run if he laughed at her. Damien did not laugh. Instead, he moved closer and peered over her shoulder at the pages. "Read it to me," he said. "None of my tutors read stories like that. They only give me boring books about the history of the kingdom and the rules of etiquette." That was how their friendship began, strange and impossible by every rule of class and birth, yet sincere in the pure way only childhood friendships could be, before children learned to despise one another for the circumstances of their birth. Every one of Lord Gareth's visits to the orphanage gave Damien and Sarah an hour or two stolen for themselves. They read books, invented stories of their own. Once, they even tried to build a little shelter out of branches at the edge of the garden, though both knew perfectly well that the adults would disapprove. As the years passed, the visits became less frequent. Damien's time was increasingly consumed by fencing lessons, court etiquette, and preparation for the responsibilities of becoming a lord. Yet whenever he did visit, something in the way he looked at Sarah changed. It matured along with them. Childhood affection slowly transformed into something more complicated, something more unsettling, something neither of them dared name aloud. His final visit before Sarah left the orphanage to enter service at the castle came when she was 15 and he was 17. Damien arrived alone that time, without his father, riding his own horse for the first time. By the standards of the nobility, he was almost a man. "You've changed so much," he told her, looking at her with an expression she did not immediately understand, something caught between admiration and pain. "You're grown up." "So have you," Sarah replied, suddenly self-conscious beneath his gaze in a way she had never been during their childhood. He fell silent. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as though there were something important he wanted to say, but could not bring himself to speak aloud. Finally, he said only, "My father says they'll soon begin arranging my betrothal to some noble girl of suitable rank." "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Sarah asked, unable to understand the bitterness in his voice. "You'll become a lord. You'll marry a worthy lady." "Worthy by rank," he interrupted sharply, "not by anything else." He never explained what he meant, and Sarah did not dare ask. Not long after that conversation, she left the orphanage to begin working at the castle, and their paths separated. Until now, 10 years later. If the latest rumors sweeping through the kitchens were true, Damien was expected to arrive at the Dragon King's court within the next few weeks. Sarah shifted on her narrow mattress and stared into the darkness above her. She thought of two men, of the king's gaze that morning, and of Damien's gaze from all those years ago. Somehow, both unsettled her with the same strange, inexplicable weight. What a strange day, she thought, closing her eyes. She had no idea how accurate that simple observation would prove to be, or how much stranger everything was about to become in the weeks ahead. Chapter 2. 3 days later, Griselda summoned Sarah to the small room adjoining the kitchen, with an expression that suggested she was about to deliver bad news. "Sit," the cook ordered, pointing to the only empty stool. "I have news, and I can't decide whether I should be happy for you or worried." Sarah sat down, wiping her hands on her apron, as a vague sense of unease began to stir in her chest. "What happened?" "An order came from the royal office." Griselda unfolded a sheet of parchment. Judging by her deep frown, she could not actually read it, and was holding the document more as proof of its importance than for any practical purpose. "You're being transferred, out of the kitchens and into service in His Majesty's chambers." Sarah froze, not immediately understanding what she had heard. "In the king's chambers?" she repeated, as though she must have misheard. "That's exactly what it says. Personal maid assigned to the Eastern Wing. You'll be responsible for cleaning His Majesty's chambers and the adjoining rooms." Griselda set the parchment aside and studied Sarah with narrowed eyes, suspicion mingling with almost maternal concern. "Tell me the truth, girl. Have you done something I ought to know about? Did he happen to see you somewhere you shouldn't have been, or in some state you shouldn't have been in?" "No." Heat rushed into Sarah's cheeks at the mere suggestion. "I ran into him in the corridor a few days ago while I was taking a tray to Counselor Edric. We spoke for a moment. He asked my name." "And that was all?" Griselda's eyes narrowed even further. "That was all," Sarah replied firmly, although the memory of the king's strange, piercing stare refused to fit comfortably into a word as simple as all. The cook sighed and shook her head, as though the world had suddenly become too complicated for her liking. "Well, an order is an order. I'm hardly in a position to argue with the royal office." She rose and gave Sarah a surprisingly gentle pat on the shoulder with one of her rough hands. "Pack your things, girl. From now on, your place is in the Eastern Wing. And," she hesitated, "be careful. The royal chambers aren't the kitchens. They have their own rules and their own dangers." Sarah nodded. Inside her, however, anxiety warred with an inexplicable and almost frightening curiosity. The Eastern Wing greeted her with a degree of luxury she had never grown accustomed to during her years among smoke-darkened kitchen walls. High ceilings, tapestries depicting dragons in flight, stone floors polished to a mirror-like shine. The Eastern Wing's housekeeper, a stern woman named Matilda, looked Sarah up and down as though deciding whether a mere kitchen maid was worthy of serving in such halls. "Your duties are simple," Matilda explained as she led Sarah down the corridor past intricately carved doors. You clean His Majesty's private chambers in the mornings while he attends council. Change the linens, keep the fireplace clean, and bring meals if he chooses to dine privately instead of in the Great Hall. You are not to speak to the king unless he addresses you first. You are not to remain in his presence any longer than necessary, and you certainly are not to stare at him longer than propriety allows. Understood? Understood. Though a voice inside Sarah whispered that rules written for ordinary servants were unlikely to account for the strange pull she had felt in that corridor 3 days earlier. Her first morning cleaning the royal chambers passed peacefully. Azarian was indeed away at council, giving Sarah time to study the rooms where she would now spend much of her day. The chambers were striking in their contradictions. On one hand, there was all the grandeur befitting a king, a massive bed with a headboard carved into the shape of dragon wings, heavy velvet curtains, and a fireplace large enough for a grown man to stand inside. Yet the smaller details were almost austere. There were few decorations, no portraits, nothing that hinted at a personal life beyond the king's duties and responsibilities. Sarah worked methodically, fluffing pillows, changing the bed linens, and dusting the sparse furniture when she heard the door open behind her. She spun around so quickly that she nearly dropped the stack of fresh sheets in her arms. Azarian stood in the doorway. He was still dressed in riding clothes, as though he had just returned from yet another flight over the borders. And he was looking at her with the same expression he had worn 3 days earlier. Recognition mixed with confusion, as though even he did not understand why her presence affected him so strongly. "Your Majesty." Sarah hurried into an awkward bow, her hands trembling with nerves. "Forgive me, I was told you would be at council until noon." "The council ended earlier than expected." His gaze remained fixed on her. "So you're the new maid assigned to the Eastern Wing?" "Yes, Your Majesty. I was transferred from the kitchens 3 days ago." Something flickered across his face, a fleeting shadow, as though he were deciding whether to admit that the transfer had happened on his personal orders. He chose not to. "I see," he said simply. He walked past her toward the desk by the window, where a stack of reports awaited his attention. Sarah returned to her work, doing her best not to look at him too often. Yet she could feel his presence with every inch of her skin. It was as though the air itself had grown heavier the moment he entered the room. She finished changing the linens and moved to the fireplace, brushing away the ashes from the previous night's fire. Then Azarian spoke again, without looking up from the documents before him. "Do you like serving at the castle?" The question caught her off guard. It was too personal, too unexpected for a king speaking to an ordinary maid. "Service is service, Your Majesty," she replied carefully, uncertain what answer he expected. "A roof over my head and food on the table isn't the worst fate for an orphan with neither family nor dowry." "That wasn't my question." Sarah went still, the ash brush frozen in her hand. She looked up and met his eyes. Golden, piercing. They were asking for honesty, not the rehearsed politeness of a servant. "Not always," she admitted at last. "In the kitchens, at least I knew my place and my duties. Here, everything is different." Different in a bad way? Or merely unfamiliar? "I don't know yet, Your Majesty." She returned to the fireplace, trying to hide her discomfort behind the appearance of concentration. 3 days is hardly enough time to decide. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, brief and faintly surprised, as though he had not expected such a direct answer from a servant. "Honesty," he remarked, "a rare quality among people accustomed to pleasing others." "Lying takes more effort than telling the truth, Your Majesty," Sarah replied, without looking away from the fireplace. "And I already have enough work without wasting my energy finding prettier words." This time he truly laughed. It was brief, as though the sound had surprised even him, but it was genuine. Sarah allowed herself a faint smile, quietly pleased that she had managed to draw some sign of life from this stern, withdrawn man. "I remember your name," he said, setting down his quill and studying her more closely. "Sarah. But where are you from? Who are your parents?" The question caught her off guard again, this time more painfully, as though he had unknowingly touched an old wound. "I don't know, Your Majesty," she answered honestly. "I was abandoned at the orphanage as an infant. There were no records of where I came from. No family ever came looking for a lost child. I'm simply Sarah, an orphan from a nameless family." Azarian remained silent for a long moment. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. Perhaps sympathy, or perhaps something more complicated, more personal, as though her answer had stirred thoughts of his own. "Strange," he murmured at last, almost to himself. "What is strange, Your Majesty?" He did not answer. Instead, he picked up his quill again, as though suddenly remembering the matters requiring his attention. "Nothing. Continue your work." Sarah nodded and turned back to the fireplace, although questions were now raging inside her. Questions she did not dare ask aloud. Something in the king's reaction told her that her unknown origins interested him far more than simple curiosity about a new maid should have. Days became weeks, and Sarah gradually settled into her new routine, cleaning the royal chambers in the mornings, occasional brief conversations with the king whenever he happened to be there at an unexpected hour, and between them, a growing, inexplicable sense of recognition that neither dared put into words. Azarian, for his part, began finding more and more reasons to remain in his chambers longer than usual, even though he had once preferred spending his time in the throne room or at military council. He started noticing things he would never have paid attention to before. The way Sarah quietly whistled an old country tune while she worked. The little frown that appeared between her brows as she concentrated on arranging the folds of the bedspread until they were perfectly even. The small scars covering her hands from years of kitchen work. And the confident, practical grace with which those hands moved. The grace of someone accustomed to hard work rather than posing for admiring eyes. Then, one morning, almost 3 weeks after Sarah's transfer to the Eastern Wing, the castle's orderly routine was shattered by news that spread through its corridors faster than wildfire. "Lord Damien Ashford is coming to court," Matilda announced after gathering all the maids of the Eastern Wing for an urgent briefing. "Heir to House Ashford and one of the wealthiest lords in the southern provinces. His Majesty personally invited him to discuss trade agreements and, according to rumour, to settle the matter of Lord Damien's future betrothal to one of the ladies at court. The guest chambers must be prepared before his arrival, the finest rooms, naturally. Spare no effort." Sarah went still. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 10 years, but she had never truly forgotten it. Damien. The same boy from the orphanage, with serious dark eyes and books of fairy tales they had shared during stolen hours in the garden. The same young man whose final look before they parted 10 years ago still returned to her memory on quiet, sleepless nights. He was coming back. No longer a boy, but a grown man. A lord preparing to become engaged to a woman worthy of his rank. And Sarah could not understand why the news made her heart tighten with such a strange, unsettling mixture of joy and foreboding. Chapter 3. Lord Damien Ashford arrived at the palace 2 days later, and the entire castle was already buzzing with preparations, long before the first riders of his entourage appeared at the main gates. Sarah watched the commotion from a window in the Eastern Wing as she changed the linens in one of the guest rooms, prepared for the less distinguished members of Damien's party. Below, in the courtyard, servants hurried through the final preparations. Stable hands readied stalls for the fine horses of the southern provinces, and Matilda herself rushed back and forth between the kitchens and the great hall, making certain everything was ready for the formal reception. Sarah tried not to think about how she would react when she saw Damien again after 10 years. But her heart betrayed her, beating faster every time she imagined the moment. She had not expected that moment to come so soon, or so unexpectedly. An hour after Damien's party arrived, Sarah was carrying a stack of fresh towels through the guest wing when a man rounded the corner ahead of her. He wore a traveling cloak still covered in dust and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being treated with respect. Sarah nearly collided with him, much as she had nearly collided with the king in another corridor of the same castle only weeks earlier. This time, however, recognition was immediate. All it took was one look into those familiar dark eyes. Sarah? Damien spoke her name as though he could hardly believe what he was seeing. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, completely forgetting the entourage following behind him, and stared at her with an expression of astonishment mixed with something deeper, something almost tender. Lord Damien. Sarah dipped into an awkward curtsy, clutching the towels against her chest as though they might shield her from his intense gaze. I didn't expect to see you so soon. Sarah, he repeated, almost as if testing the sound of her name after 10 years of silence. Then, remembering himself, he waved his entourage onward toward their assigned chambers. Go ahead, I'll catch up. His attendants disappeared down the corridor, leaving the two of them alone. Damien stepped closer, studying her face with the hungry attention of a man examining some precious thing he had lost long ago and never expected to find again. You haven't changed at all, he said softly. Well, you have, but for the better. I never thought I would see you again, especially here, in the Dragon King's palace. I've been serving here for a year, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice calm and businesslike, despite the whirlwind of conflicting emotions inside her. I started in the kitchens, now I'm a maid in the Eastern Wing. The Eastern Wing. Damien raised an eyebrow, and something resembling caution flickered in his eyes. Those are the king's own chambers, aren't they? They are, my lord. He fell silent for a moment, seemingly weighing a thought before deciding whether to voice it. Then he shook his head, dismissing whatever concern had crossed his mind. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I've found you again after all these years. He stepped closer, and Sarah caught a familiar scent from childhood, a mixture of road dust and the slightly sharp spice Southern nobles traditionally used to perfume their clothes. Do you remember our last conversation before I left, in the orphanage garden? I remember, Sarah answered quietly. The memory of that day washed over her again, carrying with it an old and strangely persistent sadness. I thought about you over the years more often than an heir of House Ashford probably should have thought about a nameless orphan girl, Damien admitted with the same blunt honesty he had possessed as a child, before courtly etiquette had taught him to hide genuine feelings behind elaborate words. I'm glad to see you again, Sarah. Truly. Sarah did not know how to respond. She felt uncomfortable beneath his unwavering, far too warm gaze, and the phrase, nameless orphan girl, cut more deeply than she wanted to admit. Not because it was untrue, but because he had said it with the same casual ease with which nobles spoke of differences in rank, even when they sincerely cared for those beneath them. I should finish my work, my lord, she said at last, trying to return the conversation to safer, more formal ground. Forgive me for keeping you. You haven't kept me from anything. He smiled, but there was something strained about it, as though he were hiding more complicated emotions behind effortless, courtly charm. Perhaps we could speak later, when you have some free time? I'd like to know what happened to you during all those years. I'm not sure that would be appropriate, my lord, Sarah replied cautiously. I'm only a maid, and you're the king's guest, here on important business. The important business can wait until this evening, Damien said, with the effortless authority of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Then, noticing the way she tensed at his tone, he softened. Please, Sarah, for the sake of the friendship we once had, just half an hour." She hesitated, torn between her desire to maintain a proper distance and her lingering affection for the boy who had once read fairy tales with her in the orphanage garden. "Perhaps after the evening meal," she finally said, "by the southern gazebo. There are fewer eyes there." Damien smiled. This time it was genuine and warm, the same smile she remembered from childhood. Agreed. Azarian had known of Lord Ashford's arrival before meeting the man in person. Reports concerning the trade caravans of the southern provinces and House Ashford's growing influence had been sitting on his desk for some time, awaiting his attention. Their official meeting took place in the throne room with all the expected ceremony, formal greetings, welcoming speeches, and polite but cautious discussions of trade tariffs and possible alliances. Damien struck Azarian as capable, but far too confident in his own importance. It was hardly unusual among southern nobles, who had grown accustomed to wealth and almost complete independence from the Dragon Crown. The discussion of trade agreements proceeded smoothly enough, although Azarian sensed a hidden tension beneath his guest's courteous words, as though Damien had come to the palace for more than the official purpose he claimed. Once the formal reception was over, Azarian returned to his chambers earlier than usual. A familiar, dragging exhaustion had begun to settle over him, the warning sign of another attack of the ashen sickness. He tried to ignore it, as he always did, to postpone the inevitable for as long as his body would allow. But the day's negotiations and the constant effort required to keep any hint of weakness from showing on his face had drained more of his strength than usual. He had barely closed the door behind him when pain crashed through his body, sharp, burning, as though glowing embers had suddenly ignited deep inside his chest, in the very place where a dragon's inner flame was meant to burn. Azarian staggered and grabbed the back of a chair. His breathing faltered. A rough, involuntary groan escaped his throat. He had not expected anyone to be in his chambers at this hour. He had assumed Sarah had already finished the evening cleaning and returned to her room, but she was still there. She had been folding fresh linens beside a cabinet at the far end of the room, and the moment she heard his groan, she spun around with immediate, instinctive alarm. "Your Majesty!" She dropped the linens and rushed toward him, forgetting every rule of propriety that forbade an ordinary maid from touching the king without permission. Azarian wanted to stop her, to order her away, to conceal the weakness he had hidden from the entire court for months. But the pain was too severe for him to summon the strength to speak. "What's wrong?" Sarah caught him by the arm and helped him lower himself into the chair, her face pale with concern. "Should I call the physician?" "No," Azarian forced through clenched teeth. "Don't call anyone. It will pass. In a minute." But it did not pass. Instead, the pain intensified, spreading through his chest in scorching waves, as though his own flame were consuming him from within, instead of giving him warmth. Cold sweat broke across his forehead. His hands trembled as they gripped the arms of the chair, as though holding on tightly enough might somehow keep his body from falling apart. Sarah had no idea how to help him, but she could not simply stand there and watch. She dropped to her knees in front of his chair and, acting on pure instinct, placed both hands over the one gripping the armrest. The effect was immediate and impossible to explain. The pain that had been tearing through him only a second earlier began to fade. It was as though invisible hands had smothered the fire raging inside his chest. Azarian opened his eyes. He had not even realized he had squeezed them shut, and stared at Sarah with an expression somewhere between astonishment and reverent horror. "What?" he whispered. With every second her hands remained against his skin. His breathing grew steadier. "What did you do?" "Nothing, Your Majesty," Sarah answered, bewildered, staring down at her own hands as though she were seeing them for the first time. I just didn't know what else to do. After several more long moments, the pain disappeared completely. Only the deep, draining exhaustion that always followed an attack remained. Yet even that felt different this time, softer somehow, as though some part of its weight had been lifted by something Azarian could not yet understand. "You need to leave," he said at last, although his voice lacked the firmness he intended. "And forget what you saw here." "Your Majesty, you're clearly unwell," Sarah protested. She was still kneeling beside his chair, her hand still resting over his, as though afraid the pain would return the instant she pulled away. "Please, at least let me call the physician." "No physicians," Azarian snapped more harshly than he intended. She flinched. His expression immediately softened. "Forgive me, it's just, this isn't something ordinary medicine can cure, and it isn't something outsiders should know about." Sarah remained silent for a long moment, looking up at him as though trying to read answers in his face to questions she did not dare ask. "All right," she finally said. "I won't tell anyone. But, Your Majesty," she hesitated, searching for the right words. "Whatever this is, you don't have to endure it alone every time. If my touch eases the pain even a little, I'm willing to help again if you need me." Azarian studied her for a long moment. Something unfamiliar was stirring in his chest, something he could not name. It existed somewhere between gratitude and the same inexplicable attraction that had seized him in the corridor 3 weeks earlier. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly. For the first time, he spoke her name with unmistakable, unguarded warmth. "I'll consider what you've said." Sarah rose and finally removed her hands from his. To his surprise, Azarian felt a faint pang of regret at losing that simple yet inexplicably healing touch. "Rest, Your Majesty," she said, stepping toward the door. "I'll finish cleaning tomorrow morning." When she was gone, Azarian remained motionless in the chair for a long time. He stared at his own hands, remembering the sensation of her touch. Warmth, peace, the complete absence of pain. Something no ordinary human touch should have been capable of giving to a dragon's body, ravaged by sickness. Then he remembered the old legends he had heard as a boy from the court chronicler. Stories of the Temple of the Keepers, whose blood could soothe the dragon's flame. Stories of priestesses to whom dragons were drawn with an intensity they could never feel toward ordinary women. Legends Azarian had long dismissed as forgotten fairy tales, stories that had lost all meaning after the temple disappeared many years ago. "It can't be," he thought, shaking his head as though he could physically drive the impossible idea away. But the seed of doubt had already taken root, and Azarian knew he would not find peace until he discovered the answer to the question now demanding to be solved. Who was Sarah, really? And why could her touch heal what nothing else could? Chapter 4. The southern gazebo was already sinking into evening shadows when Sarah arrived at their agreed meeting place, wrapping her shawl more tightly around herself against the cool spring air. Damien was waiting for her. He leaned against the carved railing, gazing out over the garden as twilight settled across it, wearing the distant expression of a man lost in his own thoughts. "You came," he said, turning at the sound of her footsteps. There was unmistakable relief in his voice, as though until the very last moment he had doubted she would actually appear. "I gave you my word, so I came," Sarah replied, stopping at a respectful distance. "Though I'm still not convinced this is wise, my lord." "Damien," he corrected gently. "When we're alone, with no one else around, call me Damien, like you used to." Sarah allowed herself a faint smile, though the feeling that there was something improper about all this still lingered inside her. "All right, Damien." They sat together on the stone bench beneath the gazebo. For a while, conversation came easily, almost as it had when they were children. They reminisced about the orphanage, about the old books they had read together, about the little shelter of branches they had tried and failed to finish. Damien told her about his years of study, his travels through the southern provinces, and the affairs of his father's estate, which were gradually passing into his hands as Lord Garrett's health declined. Sarah listened, feeling some of the old ease of their childhood friendship returning. Until the conversation turned to something far more serious. "My father insists that I become engaged soon," Damien said abruptly, looking not at her, but out into the darkening garden. "Lady Rosalind Kirkwood, noble family, advantageous alliance, everything expected of the heir to House Ashford." "Is she a good woman?" Sarah asked cautiously, feeling an uneasy tension begin to form in her chest. "I don't know," Damien admitted bitterly. "I've met her 3 times, and every conversation eventually turned to dowries and family crests. Not once did we speak about books, or dreams, or anything that actually matters to a person rather than their title." He turned toward Sarah, and in his eyes, she saw the same pain she had seen 10 years earlier, during their final meeting before she left the orphanage. "Sarah," he said quietly, "all these years, I've thought about you more often than I ever allowed myself to admit. Even now, knowing I'm expected to marry Lady Rosalind for the good of my family, I can't stop thinking about you." "Damien, just hear me out." He moved closer and took her hands before she could pull away. "I can't marry you. You understand that as well as I do. The laws of rank would never allow such a union, and my father would never approve. But that doesn't mean we have to lose each other forever. I could provide for you. A house, servants, everything you could ever need. You could stay close to me, even after I marry Rosalind, as a special part of my life. Hidden from everyone else, but real, honest, unlike a marriage made for duty." Sarah stared at him. Her initial disbelief slowly transformed into anger, so fierce it burned hotter than any flame. "You're asking me to become your mistress," she said slowly, as though she needed to hear the words aloud to make certain she had understood him correctly. "I'm asking you to remain in my life," Damien corrected, apparently failing to notice the dangerous spark growing in her eyes. "Isn't that better than losing each other completely? You would want for nothing. I would take care of you the way you deserve." "The way I deserve?" Sarah ripped her hands from his grasp and rose from the bench so abruptly that Damien recoiled in surprise. "Do you even hear yourself, Damien? You're asking me to live in the shadows, hidden from your future wife and from the rest of the world, surviving on scraps of your attention between your official duties as her devoted husband. And you call that taking care of me? Sarah, I never meant to insult you, but you did." Her voice trembled with anger and an older, deeper pain. "All my life, I was good enough to read fairy tales with you in the garden, good enough for you to remember after all these years, but never good enough to marry openly, before the whole world. And now you want me to become a secret you can hide in some dark corner of your life, while you play the loving husband to your noble wife in public." Damien opened his mouth to protest. Sarah did not give him the chance. "I am not some possession, Damien, something you can hide away somewhere convenient and take out whenever you please." Before he could react, her palm struck his cheek hard enough for the sound of the slap to echo through the suddenly silent gazebo. Damien froze. He pressed a hand to his burning cheek and stared at her in astonishment. The expression of a man accustomed to having his words accepted as fact, not treated as an insult. "Don't ever seek me out alone again," Sarah said. Her voice shook, but not from weakness. It shook with fury. "You and your father came to the orphanage offering charity. I only hope there was genuine kindness in those gifts. and not some expectation that one day you might profit from them. She turned and almost ran from the gazebo, leaving Damien alone in the darkening garden, his cheeks still burning from the slap. His confusion slowly hardened into wounded, smoldering resentment. 2 days passed before Damien tried to confront Sarah again. This time, however, there was nothing romantic about his intentions. He waited for her in the narrow corridor leading to the eastern wing storerooms, where Sarah was headed to collect fresh candles for the king's chambers. The corridor was deserted at that hour. Most of the servants were finishing their daytime duties and preparing for the evening meal. Damien had chosen his moment with the calculation of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, regardless of anyone else's wishes. Sarah. He stepped into her path before she even realized he was there. My lord. She tried to move around him. He shifted sideways, blocking her again. I need to get through. Not until we talk. There was something new in his voice, something she had never heard from him before. Resentment, mixed with wounded pride, driving him toward behavior unworthy of any noble lord. You humiliated me, Sarah. A slap from a common servant to the heir of House Ashford is an outrageous insult. I merely answered one insult with another, my lord, Sarah replied firmly, yet unease was already growing inside her. He was standing too close, and he had cut off her only path of retreat. An insult? Damien stepped closer. Sarah instinctively backed away until her shoulders met the cold stone wall. I offered you protection, security, devotion, and you rejected all of it because of your foolish pride. I rejected humiliation, not protection, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady, even as her heart began pounding with fear. Damien reached out and seized her wrist with a force no gentleman had any right to use against a woman, whether she was a noble lady or an ordinary servant. Perhaps you simply need to be reminded, he said quietly. His voice sounded strange now, almost like someone else's. The warmth she remembered was gone. Not every man is willing to tolerate that kind of defiance without consequence. Let go of me! Sarah tried to wrench her wrist free. His fingers only tightened. He planted his other hand against the wall beside her head, completely cutting off her escape. Just one conversation, Sarah, he whispered, leaning closer. She could smell wine on his breath, as though he had needed a drink to give himself courage before confronting her. One honest conversation. No anger, no slaps. I said, let me go! Her voice broke into a shout that echoed from the stone walls of the narrow corridor. And in the next instant, the air around them turned so violently cold that both of them flinched. Take your hands off her! Azarian's voice was so quiet, it was almost a whisper. Yet there was more menace in that whisper than there could have been in the fiercest roar. Damien turned. His hand was still wrapped around Sarah's wrist. At the end of the corridor stood the Dragon King. The expression on Azarian's face was enough to freeze the blood in Damien's veins. For one brief moment, his eyes blazed with an inhuman golden light, far too bright, far too dangerous to belong to ordinary human anger. Your Majesty, Damien began, releasing Sarah's wrist as abruptly as though he had been burned. This is merely a misunderstanding, a private conversation between I didn't ask for an explanation. Azarian approached with slow, measured steps. And with every step, the temperature in the corridor seemed to fall lower, as though the very air were responding to the fury raging inside him. I told you to take your hands off her. Damien took an involuntary step backward until his shoulders met the opposite wall. His face had gone pale. What he was witnessing was clearly no ordinary man's anger. It was something older, something primal, something draconic, held in check by sheer force of will. Azarian stopped in front of him, towering over Damien by nearly a head. When he spoke again, his voice was cold and perfectly calm, a calm far more frightening than any shout. "Listen carefully, Lord Ashford, because I will not repeat myself." He pronounced Damien's title with such contempt that it sounded more like an insult than an acknowledgement of rank. "Sarah is under my personal protection. If I learn that you have approached her again, in a corridor, in the gardens, anywhere in this castle or beyond its walls, the trade agreements that brought you here will be forgotten. And with them, every hope House Ashford has of prospering under the protection of the Dragon Crown." His golden eyes remained fixed on Damien. "Have I made myself clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Majesty," Damien forced out. His voice trembled with humiliation and fear. "Then get out of my sight," Azarian said, "before I decide those trade agreements aren't worth tolerating your presence in this castle at all." Damien left immediately, almost fleeing down the corridor. He left Sarah and Azarian alone. Only when the sound of his footsteps had faded into the distance did Azarian turn toward her. The transformation in his expression was immediate. The fury vanished, replaced by deep, undisguised concern. "Did he hurt you?" Azarian stepped closer, then stopped at a respectful distance, as though afraid of frightening her further after what she had just endured. "No," Sarah whispered. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she could feel her knees trembling. "You came in time." Azarian studied her for a long moment. Sarah could still see traces of the storm that had raged inside him only moments earlier. Anger, concern, and something deeper, something more personal that even he seemed afraid to name. "I don't know what came over me," he admitted quietly, almost as though speaking to himself. "When I heard you scream." He shook his head, unable to find the words. "Come, you need to rest after what happened." He extended his hand. Not with the commanding gesture of a king expecting obedience, but cautiously, almost uncertainly. The movement of a man unaccustomed to offering comfort to anyone. Sarah accepted it without hesitation. Together, they slowly walked away from the place where, only moments before, fear had nearly overwhelmed her composure. Neither of them spoke again, but both could feel it. Something between them had changed irrevocably that evening. The boundary that had once separated a king from an ordinary servant had become far less certain than it had been that morning. Chapter 5. After what had happened in the corridor, Azarian could find no peace. He had sent Sarah back to her room to rest, then gone straight to the old royal library, a vast collection of scrolls and books accumulated over generations of dragon rulers. Normally, he rarely came here. He preferred the concise reports of his advisors to the dry pages of ancient chronicles. But tonight, something drew him toward those dusty shelves and the memories of an age most of the court had long forgotten. "Your Majesty?" Old Orwin, the royal chronicler, and the only other living soul in the library at such a late hour, rose from behind his desk, clearly surprised to see the king personally entering his domain. "To what do I owe the honor?" "I need the records concerning the Temple of the Keepers," Azarian said without preamble, stopping before the elderly scholar. "Everything you have, legends, official chronicles, private journals, anything that survived." Orwin narrowed his eyes, studying the king with the perceptiveness that came from decades spent reading both ancient texts and human nature. "A curious subject for such a late hour, Your Majesty," he observed cautiously. "May I ask what has prompted your sudden interest?" "No," Azarian replied shortly. "Just find the records, Orwin. It's important." The chronicler nodded, wisely deciding not to press the matter. He disappeared into the depths of the library and returned a quarter of an hour later carrying an armful of yellowed scrolls and an old book bound in worn leather. "Here, Your Majesty." He spread the documents across the nearest table and lit several additional candles. The official chronicles concerning the temple's fall are scarce. Most of its archives were destroyed during the massacre itself, almost as though those responsible wanted to erase not only the people, but every memory of them. However, the private writings of the court chronicler from that period survived, along with several oral accounts I recorded from the oldest castle servants, those who were children when the events occurred. Azarian began to read. The records described a time before his own birth, confirming what little he vaguely remembered from childhood history lessons. There had once been an ancient temple bloodline of women whose blood possessed a unique ability to soothe a dragon's inner flame, bringing it into a state of absolute peace and balance. One surviving passage from the old court chronicler read, "Dragons sought the keepers not only for healing when their inner fire grew so fierce it threatened to consume them from within, but also for the unique bond that arose between dragon blood and the human blood of the keepers. More than once, kings of the dragon line chose wives from among the keepers, for no other women could bring such complete peace to a dragon's heart." The attraction between dragon and keeper came neither from calculation nor from the will of court matchmakers, but from an ancient call of blood, both inexplicable and undeniable. Azarian froze. He read the final lines again, and then again. That was exactly what he had experienced in the corridor 3 weeks earlier. That inexplicable pull, as though the dragon within him had recognized something important in Sarah's presence before his rational mind had even begun to understand it. "Orwin," he said without taking his eyes from the page, "what happened to the keepers? How was their temple destroyed?" The chronicler sighed and lowered himself into the chair opposite the king, looking like a man preparing to recount an old and painful story. "The official chronicles claim a fire accidentally broke out in the temple buildings," he said quietly. "But the oral accounts, passed down among the castle's oldest servants, tell a different story." Azarian waited. 25 years ago, a faction of nobles and commoners, dissatisfied with dragon rule, organized a conspiracy intended to weaken the power of your kind. Someone among them understood a simple truth. Without the keepers and their calming blood, the dragon's inner flame would gradually weaken, and dragons themselves would begin dying before their time, deprived of the ancient balance that had sustained them. Orwin's expression darkened. "They attacked the temple under cover of night and slaughtered almost the entire keeper bloodline." A heavy, icy chill formed in Azarian's chest. It had nothing to do with his sickness. "Almost?" he asked quietly. "Someone survived?" "There are rumors," Orwin said cautiously, "that one of the temple servants, a woman fiercely loyal to the keepers, managed to save the only surviving infant of the final generation on the night of the massacre. According to the story, she secretly placed the child in an orphanage, concealing the girl's identity even from the child herself, so that the conspirators could never find her." He paused. "Whether that is truth or merely a beautiful legend born from people's hope, I cannot tell you, Your Majesty. Too many years have passed. Too many witnesses to that night are already in their graves." Azarian said nothing for a long moment. Piece by piece, facts that had previously seemed like meaningless coincidences began fitting together. The massacre at the Keeper's Temple had happened 25 years ago. Sarah had recently turned 25. She had been abandoned at an orphanage as an infant, with no record of her parents or origins. And her touch, impossibly, inexplicably, yet undeniably, had soothed his ashen sickness in a way no medicine prepared by the royal physicians ever had. "Tell me, Orwin," Azarian finally said, tension audible even to his own ears. "Are there records of when a keeper's power fully manifested? Was it present from birth, or—" "Ah, Orwin gave a faint smile, as though he had been expecting precisely that question. On that point, the legends are unanimous, Your Majesty. A keeper's power did not awaken at birth. It awakened when she reached 25 years of age, a kind of coming of age of the bloodline, as the old texts called it. Azarian's attention sharpened. Before that age, daughters of the bloodline were indistinguishable from ordinary mortal women. They possessed neither the strange attraction dragons felt toward them, nor the healing properties of their touch. But upon reaching 25, the keeper blood awakened fully, revealing the power inherited from their ancestors. Azarian felt the final piece fall into place with almost terrifying precision. That was why he had never noticed Sarah during the previous year she had served at the palace. Not because she had been too ordinary to attract his attention. Her blood simply had not awakened yet. Only now, after her recent birthday, had that ancient call emerged with its full, inexplicable force. And without even understanding what was happening, he had recognized something in an ordinary kitchen maid that some part of him had been searching for his entire life. Thank you, Orwin. Azarian rose so abruptly that the chair scraped against the floor. What you told me tonight stays between us. Not a word to anyone until I decide otherwise. Of course, Your Majesty. The old chronicler inclined his head. But allow an old man one piece of advice. I have lived long enough to witness the consequences of decisions made too quickly. Azarian waited. If your suspicions are correct, if a surviving heir to the Keeper bloodline has truly been found, be very careful whom you trust with that knowledge. There are too many people at court who would benefit from seeing this secret remain buried forever. His expression became grave, and there may be others who would benefit even more from using the girl for their own purposes. Azarian nodded, acknowledging the wisdom of the warning. Then he left the library carrying the heavy burden of everything he had learned. He needed time to understand it himself before he could possibly tell Sarah. Humiliated by the king's intervention and furious over what had happened in the corridor, Damien spent the next 2 days in brooding silence. He avoided Sarah entirely, but he did not stop thinking about what had happened, and with every passing hour, his wounded resentment grew. He could finally see what he had previously refused to admit, even to himself. The Dragon King's feelings toward an ordinary servant went far beyond compassion or passing curiosity. The fury with which Azarian had protected her, the unnatural cold that had filled the corridor when his anger erupted, those were signs of something deeper, something far more dangerous to the established order. She chose a dragon over me. Damien sat alone in his guest chambers, watching the candle on the bedside table slowly burn down. The thought wounded his pride more deeply than Sarah's slap ever had. Not because he still harbored any sincere affection for her, but because his injured vanity demanded retribution for the humiliation he had suffered. It demanded that his dignity be restored at any cost. Then Damien remembered fragments of a conversation he had overheard among the servants the previous evening. They had been discussing the strange circumstances surrounding the king's new maid. How Sarah had been seen entering His Majesty's private chambers late in the evening. How Matilda had whispered with another servant about mysterious incidents involving the king's newest favorite. An idea began forming in Damien's mind. Simple and devastating. If he could not have Sarah himself, and if the king was determined to protect her with such ferocity, then perhaps the court should begin questioning the true nature of that strange and inexplicable attachment. A common maid who had somehow captured the king's attention almost overnight. A woman who had appeared from nowhere, without family or known ancestry. What better soil could there be for rumors? Whispers of witchcraft, dark magic, some unnatural power behind her mysterious influence over the Dragon King. Damien smiled at the thought. But there was none of the warmth that smile had once held, only the cold calculation of wounded pride. He would begin carefully, of course, a casual remark during a card game with other noble guests, a suggestion here, a question there, just enough to plant the seed of doubt. And then he would let court gossip do the rest, allowing that seed to grow into poisonous fruit, capable of destroying a servant girl's reputation far more effectively than any direct accusation ever could. Unaware of the intrigue forming against her, Sarah spent the next 2 days in a state of uneasy anticipation. She could not stop wondering how her relationship with the king would change after what had happened in the corridor. The answer came on the evening of the 3rd day. Azarion returned earlier than usual from another patrol of the kingdom's borders and found her in his chambers, finishing the evening cleaning. Instead of giving her his usual silent nod, he stopped near the doorway. "Sarah," he said. His voice carried an uncertainty she had never expected to hear from the Dragon King. "May I speak with you? Not as a king speaking to a servant, but differently." Sarah turned and set aside the feather duster, her pulse quickening at the tone of his voice alone. "Of course, Your Majesty." "Just Azarian," he corrected softly, taking a step closer. "At least when we're alone. No titles between us." Sarah nodded, unable to find the right words. She watched him approach with slow, almost hesitant steps, as though weighing every movement with a degree of caution utterly unlike him. "That attack you suffered," she began carefully, trying to fill the silence between them. "Did you discover what caused it?" Azarian stopped very close to her, close enough that Sarah could feel the warmth of his body, despite the coolness that so often seemed to accompany his presence. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but the explanation is so unbelievable that I can barely bring myself to say it aloud." "Tell me," she asked, raising her eyes to his face in the soft candlelight. "Whatever it is." He stared at her for a long moment, seemingly gathering the courage to speak. But instead of the words Sarah expected, something else happened. His hand rose. His fingertips touched her cheek with such tenderness that the gesture was almost weightless. And then, before either of them could fully understand what was happening, the distance between them disappeared. The kiss came suddenly, without warning, as though they had both been holding back the attraction between them for too long, and whatever barrier had contained it had finally broken. Azarian's lips were unexpectedly warm, despite the coolness that usually surrounded him. Before Sarah could even comprehend her own reaction, she kissed him back. Her heart answered before her mind could remind her of the vast divide between them, of rank, of blood, of everything they were supposed to be. The kiss lasted only a few moments, brief, stunned, almost like an accident that had taken both of them by surprise. Azarian was the first to pull away. His eyes widened as the reality of what he had just done caught up with him. "Forgive me," he whispered, taking a step back. "I shouldn't have." "It's all right," Sarah replied softly. Her cheeks were burning, and her heart seemed to be pounding somewhere in her throat. "It was just unexpected." They stood in silence, both breathing harder than before, neither able to find words that could explain what had just passed between them. Finally, Azarian spoke again. His voice was quieter now, filled with questions he had yet to voice. "Sarah," he said, "there's something important I need to tell you." He held her gaze. "About your origins. About who you may really be." Chapter 6. Sarah stood motionless, staring at Azarian, as a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation grew inside her. "My origins," she repeated quietly. "But I already told you, Your Majesty, Azarian. I know nothing about my parents. I was abandoned at the orphanage as an infant." "That is precisely why we need to talk." He gestured toward the chairs by the fireplace, inviting her to sit. What I learned in the library today may explain many things. Your origins, the inexplicable attraction I felt toward you in that corridor 3 weeks ago, and why your touch can soothe my sickness when nothing else can. Sarah lowered herself into the chair, tension tightening her shoulders as she waited for a revelation that might overturn everything she had ever believed about her own life. Azarian told her everything he had learned from the old chronicler. He told her about the Temple of the Keepers and the women whose blood had possessed the power to calm a dragon's inner flame. He told her about the massacre 25 years earlier, carried out by conspirators who had sought to weaken dragon rule. He told her about the infant who had supposedly survived, secretly taken from the temple by a loyal servant and placed in an orphanage. And finally, he told her that the power of the Keeper bloodline did not awaken until the age of 25, the very age Sarah had reached only weeks ago. Sarah listened as though the ground beneath her feet were disappearing. Everything she had always believed about her life seemed to crumble before her eyes, only to rearrange itself into something entirely different, something impossible. And yet something that explained far too much to be dismissed as coincidence. "Are you saying," she whispered when Azarian finished, "that I'm a keeper? The last survivor of an entire bloodline?" "I can't say that with absolute certainty," Azarian admitted honestly. "But there are too many coincidences to ignore. Your age, the fact that you were abandoned at an orphanage with no record of your family, your ability to ease my sickness when no known medicine can." He paused, "and my own reaction to you. There is no explanation for it, except the ancient call of blood described by the court chroniclers." Sarah remained silent for a long time. Shock and disbelief battled inside her. Yet beneath both was something else, a strange, unsettling sense of recognition, as though some hidden part of her had always known there was more to her past than simply being an orphan without a name or family. "If this is true," she finally said, her voice trembling, "then my real family was slaughtered before I was even old enough to speak." Her expression tightened with pain. "My entire life as a nameless orphan was built upon a lie, hiding the massacre of everyone who might have been my family." "I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way," Azarian said quietly. He moved closer and gently covered her hand with his. "But I couldn't keep it from you, no matter how painful it might be." Sarah looked up at him, unwanted tears gathering in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. "If I really am the last keeper, what does that mean for me?" Her fingers tightened slightly beneath his. "For us." Azarian opened his mouth to answer. A sharp knock at the door shattered the fragile intimacy between them before he could find the words. "Your Majesty!" The voice belonged to one of the royal guards, and there was unmistakable urgency in his tone. "Forgive the interruption, but Counselor Edric requests an immediate audience. The matter is urgent and concerns—" The guard hesitated. "Rumors spreading among the noble guests." Azarian and Sarah exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. Neither needed to say aloud that their conversation would have to wait. Counselor Edric was waiting in the smaller audience chamber with the expression of a man forced to deliver unpleasant news to his sovereign. "Your Majesty," he bowed, "disturbing rumors have reached me. They are spreading among the noble guests who arrived for Lord Ashford's reception. The rumors concern your new maid, a young woman named Sarah." Azarian felt that familiar, cold fury begin to rise inside him. "What rumors?" Edric hesitated, clearly reluctant to repeat the accusations aloud. "People are saying the girl has bewitched your Majesty through some unholy power, that her sudden appearance from nowhere, without family or known ancestry, is suspicious in itself, and that her inexplicable influence over you is the result of dark sorcery, sorcery that may pose a threat to the entire kingdom." Who is spreading these rumors? Azarian's voice was sharp, with barely restrained anger. It is difficult to identify the original source, Your Majesty, Edric replied carefully. The whispers seem to be circulating primarily among Lord Ashford's entourage, though no one has made a direct accusation openly. Some noble guests are already demanding explanations. Others are suggesting an investigation. He paused. And a few have begun using the word witch when speaking of your maid. Azarian clenched his fists. He had little doubt where the rumors had begun. Damien's wounded pride had found a way to retaliate for his humiliation in the corridor. Spreading accusations of witchcraft was clever, cruel, and conveniently difficult to trace back to the man who had started them. "Call an assembly of the nobility," Azarian said at last, his voice cold and decisive. "Tonight, in the Great Hall." Edric looked up. "I will deal with these absurd rumors personally." By the appointed hour, the Great Hall was filled with nobles and courtiers. Whispers swept through the gathering as everyone waited for the king, speculating about the reason for such a sudden and urgent summons. Azarian entered, wearing his full royal regalia. His expression was severe and unreadable, his steps measured and confident, and behind him, to the obvious surprise of nearly everyone present, walked Sarah. She was not dressed in her usual maid's uniform. Instead, she wore a simple but elegant gown Matilda had hastily chosen for her at the king's command. Azarian stopped before the throne. He did not sit. Instead, he remained standing, facing the assembled court directly. "I have heard disturbing rumors concerning my maid," he began. "Accusations of witchcraft, dark powers, dangerous influence over my rule." His gaze swept across the hall. "I called you here tonight to put an end to these absurd claims once and for all." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Dozens of eyes moved between the king and Sarah, who stood slightly behind him, anxiety plainly visible on her face. "Let me make this perfectly clear," Azarian continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "This woman is neither a witch nor a sorceress." The hall fell still. "She is a descendant of the ancient bloodline of the Keepers, the temple priestesses whose blood served the dragon race for generations, bringing balance and peace to our inner flame." A murmur of astonishment swept through the gathered nobles. "The same bloodline that was nearly exterminated by conspirators 25 years ago. Conspirators who sought to weaken dragon rule by destroying the very people who preserved our natural balance." The hall erupted into shocked exclamations. Azarian allowed the commotion to die down before continuing. "My attention toward this woman," he said firmly, his gaze moving across the crowd as though searching for one particular face, "is not the result of witchcraft." His voice hardened. "It is the natural consequence of an ancient bond between dragon blood and the blood of the Keepers, a bond that existed long before I was born, long before any of you were born." He turned toward Sarah and extended his hand. There was nothing ambiguous in the gesture. It was both acknowledgement and protection. And I have no intention of denying or concealing that bond any longer. Sarah looked at his hand for only a moment before placing hers in it. "Whoever has been spreading these lies," Azarian continued, now staring directly at Damien, who stood among the assembled nobles with a face gone pale with unease, "should understand this clearly." His fingers closed around Sarah's. "Slandering a keeper of the dragon bloodline will be treated as treason against the crown." The silence that followed was absolute. "I will tolerate no further rumors of this kind from anyone, regardless of title or position." Only the crackling of the torches along the walls disturbed the stillness. Standing beside Azarion, Sarah felt dozens of eyes upon her, some astonished, some admiring, others still wary. Yet, for the first time in a very long while, she did not feel the need to lower her gaze beneath their scrutiny. The assembly ended after several more minutes of formalities. The courtiers dispersed in clusters, whispering among themselves as they tried to absorb everything they had just learned. Damien was among the first to leave. His expression was darker than a storm cloud, and in his eyes burned a wounded, smoldering hatred he no longer bothered to hide. Later that night, after the great hall had emptied and the courtiers had retired to their chambers, Azarion and Sarah found themselves alone in the quiet palace garden. Only moonlight and stars illuminated the paths around them. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, looking at him beneath the silver light, "for defending me in front of everyone, for not allowing those lies to win." "I couldn't have done otherwise," Azarion replied, turning toward her. "You didn't deserve those accusations, Sarah, especially now that I know the truth about who you really are." "The last of the keepers," she whispered, as though she were still struggling to accept the impossible words. "Heir to a bloodline slaughtered to weaken the dragons." She looked at him. "And now I'm standing here beside the Dragon King, feeling something I can't even fully explain." "Perhaps we don't need to explain it," Azarion said quietly, taking a step closer. "Perhaps it is enough that we both feel it. This attraction, this bond, whatever its origin may be." Sarah raised her eyes to his, and this time, when their lips met, the kiss was no accident. Neither of them was caught by surprise. It was deliberate, slow, filled with everything they had both been too afraid to say aloud. An acknowledgement of a bond stronger than the difference in their rank, stronger than ancient prejudice between humans and dragons, stronger than the accusations born from an enemy's wounded pride. When they finally drew apart, both breathing heavily, their foreheads remained pressed together beneath the quiet moonlit sky. Azarion whispered the words Sarah would carry in her heart long after the night gave way to dawn. "Whatever the future has waiting for us, Sarah, I want to face it with you." His voice softened, not as a king and a servant, but as two people bound by an ancient call of blood. Chapter 7. The night brought not only the quiet peace of the garden, but also the first signs of an approaching storm, one neither Azarion nor Sarah yet suspected. Damien left the great hall in a state bordering on madness, driven by wounded pride. The public humiliation before the entire court, the knowledge that even his own father had witnessed a simple servant girl not only reject his offer, but become the object of the Dragon King's open protection and affection. All of it burned inside him with a fire that had nothing to do with dragon flame, yet was no less destructive to reason. He locked himself inside his guest chambers, refused the evening meal, and spent several hours pacing from wall to wall in dark, feverish thought. Eventually, a plan formed in his mind, a plan born entirely from desperation and wounded vanity. If he could not have Sarah, and if the king had openly placed her under his protection before the entire court, leaving no room for secret schemes through gossip and slander, then only one path remained. He would take her by force. He would carry her away from the castle and prove, to himself and to the world, that a common girl did not have the right to choose a dragon over the heir of a noble house. He summoned two of the most loyal members of his personal retinue, men willing to carry out nearly any command without asking inconvenient questions, provided the reward was generous enough. "Tomorrow at dawn," Damien said quietly, "while the court is still asleep after tonight's assembly, you will take the girl from her room. We leave the castle before anyone has time to raise the alarm." "And if she resists, my lord?" one of the men asked cautiously. Then do whatever is necessary. Even to Damien's own ears, his voice sounded unfamiliar, as though the words belonged to someone else, a man stripped of the last remnants of the honor years of noble upbringing had once taught him. The only thing that matters is getting her to my estate before the Dragon King discovers what happened. The plan born from Damien's desperation began falling apart long before dawn. Azarian still could not find peace after his conversation with Sarah in the garden. Unable to sleep, he decided to make a short flight around the castle grounds, as he often did on restless nights, not so much out of duty as to allow his dragon form temporary relief from the constant tension of remaining human. It was during that flight, while circling above the inner courtyard in the darkness before dawn, that he noticed suspicious movement near the eastern wing. Two dark figures were creeping along the wall toward a window Azarian knew far too well. Sarah's. His dragon sight was far sharper than any human's. Even in the darkness, he could make out details an ordinary eye would have missed. The familiar colors of Lord Ashford's household livery, and the deliberate way the men moved. They were not there for any peaceful purpose. The fury that exploded inside Azarian was so intense that, for one brief instant, it eclipsed even the familiar pain of the ashen sickness. He dove. His massive body struck the inner courtyard with enough force to make the ground tremble beneath him. Almost immediately, he shifted back into human form and rushed toward the eastern wing before the guards had even managed to sound the first alarm. But he was already too late. One of Damien's men, hearing the thunderous impact of the dragon landing, realized they had been discovered and abandoned all attempts at stealth. He smashed Sarah's window with the hilt of his sword. Sarah woke to the crash of breaking glass. She barely had time to sit up before unfamiliar hands seized her and clamped over her mouth, cutting off her scream. "Quiet," one of the kidnappers hissed, "or it will be worse for you." Sarah fought with everything she had. She kicked, twisted, and tried to tear herself free. But the struggle was hopelessly unequal. Two strong men against one woman, caught completely by surprise in the middle of the night. They dragged her through the shattered window and into the courtyard, where a sweating horse stood saddled and ready for a rapid escape. They were trying to force the struggling Sarah into the saddle when Azarian appeared. What happened next would remain forever in the memories of everyone who witnessed that night. It was the moment when the legends of a dragon's fury became terrifyingly real. "Let her go!" Azarian's voice thundered across the courtyard with such force that the glass in the nearest windows trembled. The kidnappers turned. Their faces went pale at the sight of the Dragon King standing in the courtyard, his expression filled with a rage that seemed to drain the warmth from the air itself. One of the men immediately released Sarah and ran. The other was either more loyal to his master or simply too terrified to think clearly. He dragged Sarah against himself and pressed a short knife to her throat. "Stay back, Your Majesty!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Or I'll—" He never finished. Sarah seized the brief instant of hesitation and jerked sharply aside. The blade missed her throat. Instead, it sliced across her forearm, leaving a long, bleeding cut. Pain flashed through her arm. A cry escaped her before she could stop it. That cry, and the sight of blood on the skin of the woman, whose bond with him Azarian had only just begun to understand, destroyed the last remnants of his human self-control. The air around him froze. The kidnapper's breath turned instantly to white vapor. Frost spread across the stones beneath Azarian's feet, thin cracks racing outward, as though even the ground itself could not withstand the force of his rage. "You dared spill her blood." His voice no longer sounded entirely human. It was deeper now, resonant and unnatural, as though two beings were speaking through the same throat. The kidnapper finally understood that he had crossed far beyond the boundaries of reasonable danger. He threw away the knife and tried to retreat. Too late. Azarian's body began to change before the horrified witnesses. Scales gleaming with icy light spread across his skin. His arms lengthened into powerful clawed limbs. Behind him, enormous frost-covered wings tore free, unfolding with the sound of ripping fabric, as though they had been carved from winter itself. Within seconds, the man was gone. In his place stood a dragon. Magnificent, terrifying. His enormous body shimmered with frozen light, and his eyes burned with an otherworldly, icy glow. The kidnapper screamed and ran. The dragon overtook him with a single, powerful beat of his wings. One enormous clawed forefoot pinned the man to the ground. Azarian did not kill him, but he left him utterly incapable of further resistance. At that moment, Damien appeared in the courtyard. The noise and shouting had dragged him from his chambers, and he had not even taken the time to dress. He stood in his nightshirt, staring in horror at what his supposedly simple kidnapping plot had become. This is impossible," he whispered, stumbling backward at the sight of the enormous ice dragon towering over his fallen accomplice. Azarian turned his massive head toward him. One look into those dragon eyes was enough to freeze Damien's blood. "You." The dragon's voice made the ground tremble. "You arranged this attack." It was not a question. Damien backed away. Words caught in his throat, but Azarian gave him no opportunity to invent an excuse or a lie. With one swift movement, the dragon was upon him. A massive claw caught Damien by the collar of his nightshirt and lifted the terrified lord effortlessly from the ground. "Azarian!" Sarah's voice cut through the courtyard like a beam of light through darkness. She had managed to get back to her feet. One hand pressed tightly over the bleeding cut on her forearm. She stepped forward, despite the weakness brought on by blood loss and shock. "Don't kill him!" Her voice trembled with pain and exhaustion, but her words were firm. "He deserves to stand trial for what he did, but he doesn't deserve to die by your hand in a moment of rage." The dragon turned his enormous head toward her. His eyes still burned with icy fire. For a moment, he simply stared at her, as though searching her face for permission, or perhaps justification, to surrender to the vengeance roaring inside him. Sarah did not retreat. She did not look away. Before her stood a creature of terrifying power, a dragon capable of crushing a man with almost no effort. And yet she knew him. He was the same man she had kissed only hours earlier beneath the moonlight in the quiet garden. Something in her calm determination, and in the complete absence of fear in her eyes, made Azarian hesitate. The struggle between fury and reason flickered visibly in his icy gaze. At last, he lowered Damien back to the ground. He did not hurt him, though his claws remained firmly hooked into the collar of Damien's nightshirt, leaving no possibility of escape. "You will stand before the royal court," the dragon said. His voice had softened slightly, but the threat within it remained unmistakable. "Your father will learn the true character of his heir, and every trade agreement between our houses will be severed permanently." Damien trembled beneath his grip. "But you will keep your life, not because you deserve mercy, but because the woman you tried to abduct has shown you more mercy than you ever showed her." By then, the castle guards, finally roused by the commotion, were pouring into the courtyard. Once Azarian was certain the immediate danger had passed, his transformation began to reverse. The scales receded. His wings folded and disappeared. His enormous body gradually returned to human proportions until, where the massive ice dragon had stood only moments earlier, there was once again a man. Azarian was breathing heavily. The abrupt transformation had clearly drained him. He staggered. Sarah rushed toward him despite her own weakness and caught him before he could fall to his knees. "Are you all right?" she whispered, forgetting her own wound as she looked at him in alarm. Azarian stared at the blood running from her forearm. "That is what I should be asking you." His expression filled with guilt. "Forgive me, Sarah. I should have anticipated something like this. I should have protected you better." "You came in time," she said firmly. "That's enough." Under Counselor Edric's orders, the guards arrested Damien and his remaining accomplice, who was still barely conscious after having been pinned beneath the dragon's claw. The courtyard was gradually filling with frightened courtiers, awakened by the chaos. Azarian ignored every staring face. Despite his own weakness, he lifted Sarah into his arms and carried her toward the royal physician, murmuring quiet words of reassurance meant for her ears alone. The wound on Sarah's forearm was not deep, but the royal physician insisted that it required proper care and several days of rest. Azarian rarely left her room for longer than necessary. He spent hours beside her bed while she recovered from the shock of the attack. On the second day, he personally brought her a tray with a light breakfast, refusing to entrust even that small task to the servants. "What happened to Damien?" Sarah asked, as Azarian sat on the edge of her bed. "The royal court found him guilty of organizing your abduction and attempting to take your life," Azarian replied. "He has been stripped of his position as heir to House Ashford and permanently banished from the Dragon Kingdom. If he ever returns, he will face execution." Sarah remained silent. "His father was horrified when he learned what his son had done," Azarian continued. "He personally apologized to me for Damien's disgraceful actions." Sarah nodded. A strange mixture of relief and sorrow filled her. It was difficult to reconcile the man Damien had become with the boy who had once sat beside her in an orphanage garden reading fairy tales. Their childhood friendship had begun with innocence and ended in betrayal that had nearly cost her life. "And what about us?" she asked quietly. She looked at Azarian, hope mingling with uncertainty in her eyes. "What happens now that the entire court knows the truth about my origins?" Azarian took her hand. His gaze held the same warmth she had seen during their first real kiss. "Now," he said, "I intend to correct an ancient injustice against your people." Sarah listened in silence. "The keepers served dragons faithfully for generations. They gave us balance and peace, and in return, they were betrayed and slaughtered by those who feared their true power." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "I want to restore the ancient bond between our bloodlines, not through some formal arrangement or political agreement, but through something real, something honest between you and me." Then Azarian lowered himself onto one knee beside her bed, still holding her hand. His eyes shone with open, unmistakable tenderness. "Sarah, I know I'm asking a great deal of you. A title, a world of courtly obligations that has never been yours. The responsibility of becoming queen of the dragon bloodline, on top of everything you have only just discovered about yourself as the last keeper." Sarah's breath caught. "But I promise you this." His voice softened. "Beside me, you will never again be treated as a nameless orphan, forgotten by the world." He looked directly into her eyes. "You will become what your bloodline was always meant to be, a source of peace and balance for the dragon throne." He paused. "But before any of that, you will be the woman I love and respect. Your thoughts, your wishes, and your feelings will matter to me more than any expectation of this court." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but this time, they were not tears of grief or fear. They were tears of relief, of happiness so overwhelming she could barely find her voice. "Yes," she whispered. A smile broke through her tears. Yes, Azarian. I'll walk this path with you, no matter how unexpected a turn fate has taken to bring us here. Their wedding took place 2 months later. By then, the wound on Sarah's forearm had healed completely, leaving only a thin white scar, a reminder of the night that had nearly cost her life, but had also become the turning point that bound her fate irrevocably to that of the Dragon King. At Sarah's personal request, the wedding was more modest than full royal protocol demanded, yet it was still grand enough to satisfy the nobles who had traveled from every corner of the Dragon Kingdom to witness the historic union. Griselda, the old cook who had taught Sarah everything she knew about working in the kitchens, wept openly with pride as she watched the ceremony. She sat among the invited guests from the lower classes, people Azarian had personally insisted be given places of honor in the Great Hall. After the ceremony, while the feast was in full swing and musicians played for the dancing couples, Azarian led his new wife onto the balcony. From there, they could see the palace grounds bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. "Do you remember the first day we collided in that corridor?" he asked, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the sunset. Sarah smiled. "I remember. You looked at me as though you'd seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," Azarian corrected gently. He looked down at her. "Fate." His smile softened. Fate I had failed to recognize, even though it had been living under the same roof as me for an entire year. Sarah turned toward him and placed her palm against his chest, the same place where the ashen sickness had once caused him such terrible pain. Now there was only warmth beneath her hand, steady, healthy. The dragon flame that had once been slowly consuming him had finally found the balance it had been missing. "Now," Sarah said quietly, "we can restore what was lost all those years ago. Not only for us, but for the keepers and for the dragons who may one day find peace again beside the descendants of my bloodline." Azarian bent toward her and kissed her with the same tenderness as on the night they had first truly acknowledged what existed between them. Around them, the setting sun painted the sky in warm shades of gold, a new beginning born from the ashes of an old tragedy. And at last, after everything they had endured, a beginning filled with the peace and happiness they had both earned. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. I hope this story brought you vivid emotions and left a little warmth in your heart. And what would you have done if you were in Sarah's place? Would you have taken the risk of trusting the Dragon King, knowing that the fate of an entire kingdom depended on your choice? Or would you have chosen to leave the past behind and live an ordinary life? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. See you again soon. With love, Karina and Mia.